I think we're going to make a start. Thank you all very much for coming along to our Cafe Scientific event this evening. My name is Ken Skelton. I'm the head of public engagement at the Wellcome Genome Campus. And this is a programme of events that we run throughout the year, every month, usually on a Wednesday in the cafe here. And the idea is just to give you the chance to hear about a topic, usually something that's quite topical or contemporary, to do with science and technology, and then your chance to ask questions and debate the topic. So it's really a very informal environment. There's no such thing as a daft question, and we really hope that you get involved in asking questions, particularly after the break. Before the break, we'll have our speaker give a 20-minute presentation. I'll introduce Richard in just a second, and that just sets the scene. That gives you a flavour for the kind of topics we'll be talking about tonight. There's a myriad of paperwork on the tables. It's really shocking. We will have to look at this in the light of environmental challenge, but there are a couple of things that I just want to draw your attention to. One is the evaluation form. That is really important. If you could please fill that out before you leave tonight. It's important to find out what you think about these events. And the other is the programme itself. There's one more event in this series, which is in November, and so please hopefully see some of you at that. Okay, so tonight we have Dr. Richard Milne, who works actually at the Wellcome Genome Campus. He's part of a team called the Society and Ethics team, which is one of the teams within the area that we work in, actually, in the public engagement group. But Richard also works one day a week at the University of Cambridge, an Institute for Public Health, and he's very interested in data and the sharing of data, and particularly how that data then gets used in research, and the sort of trade-offs between the issues and the concerns that people might have around that, and the benefits of doing it. So I'm not going to say much more. I'm just going to hand over to Richard to lead the discussion, and then we'll resume for a break and then the questions.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ken, and thanks everybody for coming out. So I'm Richard Milne. I'm a social scientist. I'm a sociologist by background, and my research looks at questions around data, both in a research setting and increasingly in a clinical setting. And I'm particularly interested in work around dementia and early diagnosis. And but I think that I kind of was thinking about how I should start this talk, and because it's not because I'm not giving slides, which is terrifying not to have that crutch behind me, like something to point to, or at least something else for people to look at. And I was just thinking about that kind of role of medical records. So I grew up, my parents were both GPs, and so I used to go after school to my parents' GP's practice at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'd sit there till about 6 when somebody would kind of say like hi. And most of the time I was sitting in the back room, which was always to me like a library. It was the most incredible room because it was stacked, ceiling to floor, with these small manila envelopes, which were called Lloyd George records. And Lloyd George folders, so they're about so big. And they were fascinating because they were always they were the room, essentially, but they were also things that you didn't touch because they were the medical records of the entire practice. So I used to kind of sit there in the corner. And it's this idea of these things being both kind of fascinating and valuable and also kind of precious in a way, I think, that provides a framing for a lot of the work around how we think about medical data, genomic data, and health. So some of what I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to try and set a bit of a scene about what health data is and why we might think about sharing it. And then I'm going to look at some of the ways that sharing health data can benefit us, and then think about some of the concerns that we might have around sharing health data, and what we might do in order to balance them and to move beyond that. And one thing I am going to talk about as well briefly is some work that we've been doing at the Wellcome Genome Campus, which is a study called Your DNA, Your Say, which started off as a study led by Anna Middleton, who's who leads our group, as a survey of public attitudes towards genomic data sharing in the UK, the US, Australia, and Canada. And then people kind of got interested in it, and it's been translated, and it's been translated again. And now we have data from 22 countries around the world in 14 different languages into how people think about questions related to genomic data sharing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data that we've got from that as well. So, thinking about what is it that we're actually talking about in terms of health data. So the first thing is fairly obvious. It's the envelopes. It's your health records held at your GP or at the hospital. And that's everything from kind of basic demographic data, how old are you, where do you live, to diagnoses, test results, kind of correspondence, those kind of things. But it's also a much bigger question. I mean, health data essentially is anything that relates to provides information on your health. So it's also increasingly genetic and genomic data. It's whole genome sequences, which brings a whole different range of questions. This is information that's very personal. It's shared among families and among family members, and that is persistent. So your genome when you're born is your genome when you die, and at any point that it's sampled, it can tell you things about, potentially, things that might happen to you in the future. And then there's another set of data which is becoming really interesting, and which I'm kind of just starting some work on at the moment, and I find fascinating, which is the data that doesn't come from the health service, and it doesn't come from the 100,000 Genomes Project or the Genomic Medicine Service. It comes from our smartphones, it comes from headbands that we wear to help us sleep or monitor our sleep. It comes from our Fitbits. And this is data, or it comes from sending saliva samples off to 23andMe or whoever else. And this is data that is, again, is really relevant to our health, but is kind of completely outside the systems that we consider health data. And so it's kind of an interesting time to be talking about the ethics of health data sharing when actually health data is expanding massively as a category. But let's think about health data, so health record data. Sorry, I've got to end up in a kind of eternal loop. The main reason that your health records might be shared are to help your care. So it's always useful if one GP in your practice can see the records that have been written by another GP in your practice. Or if within a hospital somebody can see information about you as you're transferred through. Or if information about you can be transferred from your GP to your pharmacy. And so there's a kind of fundamental basis for sharing health information to provide care. But then there's a kind of range of other things that you might want to do with that data. So the most obvious one, and obviously the one that that occupies a lot of thinking, is for research. So if you take something like the 100,000 Genomes Project, which has sequenced the genomes of actually, I think it's about 85,000 people, which always confuses me because it doesn't quite seem to do what it says on the tin. But anyway, so yeah, the 100,000 Genomes Project. In that context, so that's a project which cuts across research and clinics. So it provides clinical information back to people, but it also uses that genomic information to kind of generate science. That's based on the fact that data from people with rare diseases or from people with cancer is shared with the research project, combined with the genomic information, combined with data from other health providers, to provide a kind of picture of what's going on, and some of that is then shared back to the hospitals if it's information that it can be acted upon. So there's this kind of research function, and you have this throughout. So there's a long-term study running in the Institute of Public Health called the Cognitive Function and Aging Study, which is a longitudinal study which has followed people, two waves of people since, well, the first wave from the mid-1980s to around 2000, the second wave from early 2000s to now. And this is a study that's aimed at understanding how people age, what happens to people's brains as they age and people's cognition. And it provides a basis for loads of the things when you see kind of predictions of how many 100,000 people are going to have dementia in 10 years. This is based on the cognitive function and aging study. But part of the way it does that is the fact that when the researchers go out and they sit in people's houses asking them questions about their cognition and about kind of their lifestyle and all those things, that's linked up with their GP record. So people consent, people give informed consent for their research records to be linked with their clinical records. And that then enables the research to kind of get a kind of real detail on how many people are diagnosed, when are people diagnosed, what happens, how many people aren't diagnosed, but actually when they, in the research, do seem to have some kind of level of cognitive impairment. So it's a kind of, so there's the research purpose, but there's also the use of health data for things like planning. It's useful to know how many people in an area have a particular condition, and that requires sharing some level of statistics on the incidence of a condition in a certain area. So there's kind of, as you think about the range of different ways in which health data might be used, you then get into the fact that, so for genomic data specifically, it gets slightly more complicated, because not only does this data have implications for an individual, it also has implications for their family members, and you very rapidly get into questions about what are the responsibilities of clinicians for sharing information, not just with other clinicians for care, but also with other family members. And that kind of gets to the heart, I think, of some of the main, the main way in which we tend to think about ethical issues associated with data, health data, which is in terms of confidentiality and privacy. So we tend to think, so confidentiality is the kind of fundamental principle of medical interactions. And so the point, it's kind of foundational that we are the ones who have a say over who has access to data about us. And this is it's not only that kind of the foundational principle, it's also the thing that's most clearly protected. When we talk about safeguards on health data, there's been a huge amount of attention to how we stop unauthorized access, unacceptable uses of our health data. So GPs, hospitals have data protection officers who are in charge of that, of kind of checking who are responsible for the data in that hospital. NHS Digital, which is the overarching body, has a data governance, a data access board. There's the National Data Guardian, who oversees all of that. There's the Information Commissioner's Office, who are the kind of independent regulator of data access. So we've paid an awful lot of attention to making sure that data access and data is confidential and private, and that particularly in the case where that information is identifiable, where that relates to an identifiable individual. But it doesn't always have to relate to an identifiable individual. So if you think about the other people in this room, at the moment they are all identifiable. If you wear glasses and you take your glasses off and they start to blur a bit, they start to become de-identified. They're still people, you still know that that's a person, but you might not be able to tell who that is. And so that's that's one way, as you start to remove personally identifying information, that data becomes de-identified and it becomes then potentially able to circulate more easily, because you're not telling anybody anything about somebody who, you're not telling anything about somebody identifiable. And then often you can completely, not often, but sometimes you can completely anonymize individuals. You can strip all of the identifying information away. So, for example, if you just want statistics on how many people in an area have dementia, you don't need to know which people. You don't even need to know a huge amount of detail at all about those individuals. You just need to know numbers. You might also like to know age ranges. But this is information that is comparatively anonymizable. I'm not quite sure it's a word, but it'll and that specifically is difficult to re-identify. That's the kind of the metric of anonymity. How difficult is it to re-identify? If it's relatively easy to re-identify people, if you can say, actually there's only 5 people in this village who are between 70 and 75 with dementia, then actually you can identify them. So kind of that total anonymity is dependent upon how easily somebody can be identified. So when we talk about this concern about privacy and the ways in which it's protected, there's that kind of set of regulations and laws. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get kind of too deeply involved in things like kind of general data protection regulation and all these kind of the regulatory environment. But this is something that is there. And then when you talk about the sharing of information within the NHS, if you think about beyond the use of your own data for your own care, or data related to you for your own care, and all these secondary uses of data, you can actually opt out of those. So you can go on to NHS Digital, or you can phone up, and you can say, I don't want data related to me, to my health records to be used for anything other than my own care. There's the concern that if enough people do that, so say, for example, you have a data scandal, like Cambridge Analytica, where people start to lose faith. So Cambridge Analytica, nothing to do with health data, but it's about the unauthorized sharing of data related to you for purposes that you probably didn't know anything about, and you're kind of, so quite rightly, a lot of people after Cambridge Analytica were kind of, suspicious of how Facebook were using their data. But if you have a case like Cambridge Analytica, or even more seriously, if you have a case like Cambridge Analytica that in a health space, and you have enough people who are concerned about that everybody phones up, or they go online and they say, I don't want my data to be used for anything other than my healthcare, you end up in a situation where you have data on the NHS and on the people that it serves, which has great big holes in it. And it no longer has the kind of the uses and the value, whether it's for planning or for research, that we'd hoped that it would have. So all of those other secondary uses become suboptimal, I suppose you could say, but they're damaged. And if we want to be able to use data from the NHS or data from the NHS, from GPs or from hospitals, to be able to improve constantly the quality of care, then we need to think about how people use things like the opt-out. And it relates really to a kind of second set of considerations and principles that you might bring to thinking about data. And this is something that we do. So we do some work with an organisation called the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, which is a global alliance for research in genomics and health. It's the most profoundly unimaginative title, but they have spent a lot of time over the last few years working out frameworks for technical standards. So in the same way as you might want to get a document from Word to OpenOffice or a PDF to a docx, you have the similar kind of compatibility standards with how do you get genomic data from one system to another system? How do you establish kind of comparability and interpretability across these things, across these domains? So they did a lot of work about kind of establishing global standards, but they've also done a lot of work on thinking about what kind of framework would we want for responsible data sharing and to enable genomic data that's collected in the UK to inform research and care in Australia or in China and vice versa. How do we make that work? And their framework starts from the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which has this bit in it which talks about the right of every human to benefit from the advances of science. And it creates this kind of need to, when we think about data sharing, to think about how the benefit is distributed and how we maximize the value and the use that we get from data. And it means that as we start to think about the kind of what's an ethical use of health data, it's not just the concerns about privacy and confidentiality, but it's also concerns about how do we get the most out of this for the common good. How do we ensure that common good is fairly distributed? And these two things aren't necessarily in tension. As going to drive, you can quite happily have a system which respects confidentiality, respects privacy, and also achieves the common good. But as we, as a society, as individuals whose data is in the system, think about what we do with that data, you might argue we need to think about not just individual privacy, but also the potential value of that data. But that's not always straightforward. So just to go back to the Cambridge Analytica example, I would say that in our work and in work that other people have done, if you ask people, actually we could try, who here would be willing to share their health data for use by a doctor to make a diagnosis in another person? So that's most of you. That's yeah. This is good so far. How about who would be willing to share their health data for use by an academic researcher? Okay, that's about the same. That might reflect the fact that there's a few academic researchers who obviously feel that they're people who need data. How about who here would share their data for use by a company in drug development or development of new diagnostic technologies?
Has it been anonymised?
Yes. De-identified.
De-identified.
Okay, so that's slightly less, but yeah. So we asked that question in our survey, you're saying, and we found that in the UK, so about 50% of people said that they would be happy to share for their data to be used by doctors to diagnose in a diagnosis of somebody else. We had about 40%, just slightly over 40%, said they'd be happy for it to be used by academic researchers. We found about 20% of people said that they'd be happy for it to be used by a commercial, by a company. And this is when you do studies of public attitudes, this tends to be the pattern, that people are quite happy for doctors, the NHS particularly, to have their data. They're quite happy for kind of university and academic research, but then once you get to company research, commercial research, it drops off quite a lot. And this is a challenge in that if you go back to the, my parents' surgery, for example, every record that was in those manila files is now in a system called EMIS, which is a private sector medical records company whose systems have been developed based on the fact that they have access to lots of medical records and they can work out how it works. Even more fundamentally, if you look at the use of, if you look at things like the 100,000 Genome Project, part of the benefit of those projects is potentially going to be realised through the use of those data by pharmaceutical companies, by diagnostic companies, and that it becomes increasingly difficult for people to separate out commercial and public sector uses. So the way that that's often, so it becomes complicated from that sense that we have these surveys in which people say we do not want companies to have our data. When you in qualitative work, so where people have done interviews and focus groups and deliberative work where people meet over several days and they talk about potential uses of health data and who might be using it, why might be using it, they have a chance to ask questions of experts and get presentations from experts. Actually, there's often a kind of pragmatic acceptance that this is the way it is and that maybe it's not the end of the world if some companies have access to this. But what it does raise then is the question that whenever you hear somebody talking about data, particularly in a policy thing. There's the point at which people say we need to make sure we have people's trust. We need public trust. And it becomes, so I'm a sociologist. Trust is a very sociology concept. And I'm going to try not to get too sociological on you at this point, because it's essentially, it's one of the fundamentals of how kind of societies work, is that you particularly if you don't have a direct relationship with somebody, essentially you have to trust. You might think, so for example, if you think about the ways in which people would eat food around 1900, where most food was relatively local, and most producers were relatively local, and most shopkeepers were relatively local. People didn't used to have trust in their food system in the same way, because they actually knew, because they had a kind of more direct relationship with it. They could observe it, they could see it. It was it was transparent in that sense. And by the 1990s, as things started to become clear that there were these big gaps in the food system, trust became much more important. And it's to some extent the same with health, in that we have very high levels of trust in doctors, particularly in our own doctor. So in our study, it's about 85% of people say that they trust their own doctor with their health records, which is comforting. People are also quite trusting of other doctors within the same health system, so about 55% of people. And again, it shelves off overall at about 40% for academic researchers, and down to about 9% for companies in terms of how trusted they are with their data. And trust, there are two components of trust that are important. So trust overall is this kind of idea that the people that you ask to do something, or that you rely on to do something, will do it with your interests at heart, and that they'll aim to pursue the benefits that you hope they will, and they'll aim to minimize the risks associated with them. And inevitably, whenever we're in a relationship of trust, there's a question of vulnerability. You have to be, if you're not vulnerable, you don't need to trust. If you've got nothing to lose, then it doesn't matter what happens. So there's a kind of vulnerability that underlies trust. And there's also a gap. So like you would like to think that the people that you're thinking about trusting are going to do what you hope they do, based on your previous experience with them, based on your knowledge of their competence and their qualifications and whatever else. But ultimately, you can't know for certain. So it's what one sociologist calls it a leap of faith. That at some point you just have to go, and you have to, in this case, give them your data, because you've decided that you've kind of done this assessment. And that, if you talk about the leap of faith, then you switch the discussion as well from thinking about trust to also thinking about trustworthiness. And this is something that's coming up more and more, because when you see people talk about the need to, I saw it earlier on this week, people talking about the need to create and maintain public trust, that actually there's an emphasis in the other direction, which is what are the conditions, what is it that we do as researchers, what is it that health systems do, what is it that policymakers do, and companies can do to ensure that they are trustworthy. Because if you put your trust in somebody who's not trustworthy, then it's a wasted trust. And so this brings us then back to things like the importance of transparency and being able to see how our data is being used, where it's being used, how the benefits that we thought were going to come out of that are being pursued, who's actually working on these things. It means things like being clear about if somebody does misuse your data and your trust does prove to be misplaced, what's going to happen in that sense, both in terms of the sanctions that might be placed upon them, but also in terms of knowing that there's something that can come back to you that can mitigate the harm that's occurred to you. And it may also mean thinking about how we exercise control over over our data and also over the kind of decision-making process around data. And so, I mean, my feeling is that as we kind of start to think about all this different data that's coming from all these different places, so moving away from the health data and into the kind of data that I talked about at the start, this range of health data that's actually not health system data, if you see what I mean. It's coming from personal genomics companies, it's coming from Fitbit, it's coming from Apple or wherever else. That in order to establish trustworthy uses of this data, we may need to think about how we establish new institutions or new bodies to manage and control that data. And so I wanted to finish off with this idea that there are some kind of very interesting and quite cool new ways of doing this. So one is there's a lot of discussion around things like data trusts, which would be independent bodies that are set up to specifically collate and manage data. So you would take your data from 23andMe, you would request your data from 23andMe, or you'd request your data from Fitbit, and then you then as an individual could deposit it in this trust, and that would then be managed on your behalf for your public good. And actually there are some examples as well of things called data cooperatives. These kind of new ways of dealing with data and engaging with data and managing data that are starting to come together. So there's a data cooperative established in Barcelona, where the idea is that everybody's eligible to join. They can bring their own data related to them, their own health data. They can put it into this cooperative, and they then get a say in it. It establishes a kind of a critical mass, and that they can say, we've got however many thousand people here with this standardized Fitbit data or this standardized other type data, and that they then, as a group, have the ability to say, yes, we want to direct our data there, or yes, we want to direct our data there, but we don't want it to do that. And that it provides a means of kind of cooperative control over that. So, I'm going to wrap up about that, and I just want to say, so thank you, and I think hopefully that provides a prompt for some further discussion around data. So, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.